Tonight, we're covering the incredible and harrowing story of the Battle of Omaha Beach, one of the most pivotal and courageous moments of World War II. On June 6, 1944, American soldiers stormed the heavily fortified shores of Normandy, facing brutal resistance to help liberate Europe from Nazi control. Their bravery, sacrifice, and determination turned the tide of the war and shaped the course of history. Omaha Beach became a symbol of resilience, brotherhood, and the extraordinary cost of freedom. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now, let's get right into our powerful story, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. The wind swept cold across the English Channel in early June 1944. The sky, heavy with low clouds, cast a gray shadow over the water. Thousands of ships, battleships, landing craft, troop carriers, waited off the coast of southern England in what had become the most ambitious and secretive military operation in modern history. The Allies called it Operation Overlord. Its goal: to launch a full-scale invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe and open a Western front that would ultimately lead to the fall of Hitler's Third Reich. The heart of this plan was simple, yet staggering in scale. More than 150,000 troops, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft would cross the English Channel and storm the beaches of Normandy, France. Among the 5 landing sites chosen, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword, one stood out for its formidable defenses and high risk: Omaha Beach. Stretching nearly 6 miles along the Normandy coast, Omaha was surrounded by steep bluffs, riddled with German bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. The beach itself was narrow, lined with beach obstacles, hedgehogs, mines, wooden stakes, and overlooked by entrenched German forces of the 352nd Infantry Division. The German commanders expected an invasion but had no idea where or when it would come. And when it did, they were ready to fight. The responsibility for capturing Omaha Beach fell to the United States Army's 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, supported by specialized combat engineers and armored units. For weeks, they had trained rigorously across England, preparing for the unknown. Young soldiers wrote letters home, some confiding quiet fears. Others joked to mask nerves. But all of them understood what was at stake. Commanders reviewed maps, studied tide tables, rehearsed assaults with scale models. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower made final preparations, weather forecasts weighing heavily on every decision. The invasion was originally set for June 5th, but dangerous storms delayed it by 24 hours. Time was running out. The longer they waited, the more the enemy would be ready. Finally, on the night of June 5, 1944, Eisenhower gave the go-ahead. In the pre-dawn darkness, more than 5,000 ships slipped into the channel. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway. Aboard those ships were thousands of American soldiers bound for Omaha Beach. Among them were 18-year-olds fresh out of high school, veterans of North Africa and Italy, and men who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Packed tightly into Higgins boats and landing craft, they clutched rifles, photos of loved ones, and letters they may never get to send. Above them, the roar of aircraft engines filled the sky. Thousands of Allied bombers and transport planes flew ahead to soften German defenses and drop paratroopers behind enemy lines. The hope was to disorient the Germans, knock out artillery, and give the landing troops a fighting chance. But as history would soon reveal, fate had other plans. As the early hours of June 6 approached, the horizon began to glow. The gray waters of the channel churned under steel hulls. Soldiers peered into the mist, staring toward the French coast, hearts pounding. For many, it was the last moment of quiet they would ever know. They didn't yet know what awaited them. They didn't know that bombers had missed most of their targets, that the tide would carry them into heavy fire, that their landing craft would open not onto firm ground, but into chaos, gunfire, and blood. They didn't know that Omaha would become one of the deadliest beaches of D-Day. But they knew their orders. They knew they had to go. And they were ready. The sky began to lighten in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944. As the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, the massive Allied invasion fleet came into view. Off the coast of Normandy, the water teemed with landing craft, destroyers, battleships, and troop transports, an armada stretching as far as the eye could see. Aboard the American landing craft, tension gripped every man. Engines roared as the small boats bobbed violently in the rough surf. Sea spray and nausea were constant companions. Some men vomited into their helmets. Others sat silently, gripping their rifles, lips moving in silent prayer. The target, Omaha Beach, a stretch of sand that now lay just beyond the mist and fog. As the landing craft approached, the thunder of naval artillery filled the air. Battleships and cruisers shelled the German fortifications on the bluffs, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. Explosions echoed across the water. It was meant to weaken the defenses before the soldiers arrived, but the results would prove tragically insufficient. Due to poor visibility and rushed planning, most of the naval bombardment missed its targets. German bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries remained largely intact. The defenders, many of them battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, waited silently behind reinforced concrete walls, watching as wave after wave of American troops drew closer. As the first Higgins boats neared the shore at around 6:30 a.m., the sea turned deadly. German gunners opened fire with withering accuracy. Bullets tore through the air, pinging off steel and slicing through flesh. Shells exploded around the boats, sending geysers of water and men into the sky. The front ramps of the landing craft slammed down. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, rushed forward. But many never made it more than a few steps. Machine gun fire from German MG-42s, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, cut down soldiers as they exited the boats. The water near the shore turned red. Bodies floated in the surf. Equipment sank. Confusion and terror reigned. Survivors dove into the frigid water, some losing rifles, helmets, even boots as they tried to stay alive. Many found themselves stuck in chest-deep surf, weighed down by gear. Others were tangled in underwater obstacles or barbed wire. Engineers tasked with clearing these defenses were shot before they reached the shore. On the beach, there was no cover. The sand offered no protection. German mortars and machine guns blanketed the area with relentless fire. Soldiers crawled forward, inch by inch, clinging to tank traps and the bodies of fallen comrades for any shred of safety. Communication broke down. Units were scattered. Officers were killed within moments of landing, leaving squads leaderless and disoriented. Despite the chaos, small groups of men began to organize. Junior officers and sergeants took command, rallying the survivors. Medics risked their lives to tend to the wounded, dragging men behind cover or shielding them with their own bodies. Combat engineers tried desperately to clear mines and obstacles under constant fire. A few DD tanks, amphibious Sherman tanks, managed to make it to shore, providing some much-needed firepower, but many had sunk in the heavy surf before reaching the beach. Still, the few that arrived began engaging German bunkers, drawing fire away from the exposed infantry. For the Americans at Omaha, the beach had become a trap, deadly, exposed, and merciless. And yet, even in the face of horror, the soldiers didn't stop. They fought forward. Crawling, running, bleeding, they fought to survive, to reach the seawall, and to take the high ground. Because they knew, if Omaha fell, the whole invasion might fail. By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach had become a nightmare. The tide was rising, pushing wreckage and bodies up the sand. Smoke choked the air. The cries of the wounded and the thunder of gunfire echoed across the shoreline. American troops were pinned down, trapped between the cold steel of the Atlantic and the unrelenting fire from German positions above. Many of the first waves had been decimated. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions suffered brutal losses. The carefully laid plans of Operation Overlord had unraveled within minutes of landing. Radios were soaked and useless. Landing zones were scattered. Units were mixed and confused. The carefully orchestrated assault had given way to raw, unfiltered survival. And yet, amid the chaos, men adapted. Lieutenants, sergeants, and privates alike made decisions that would turn the tide. They didn't wait for orders. They gave them. With no clear direction, soldiers started moving laterally across the beach, finding small pockets of shelter, regrouping with whoever they could find. Leadership was organic. It came from those who refused to lie still and die. One of those men was Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith, who rallied his men under heavy fire, leading them across the beach and up the slopes to assault enemy positions. His courage and leadership would later earn him the Medal of Honor, posthumously. Another was Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division. At a moment when the invasion hung in the balance, Cota waded ashore under fire and moved among the pinned-down troops, shouting, "Get off the beach! Go and land! You can do it!" He personally led assaults on German strongpoints, setting an example of leadership in the face of death. At the base of the bluffs, men reached the shingle bank, a narrow strip of rocky terrain providing the first real cover from machine guns. Behind this, the beach leveled off briefly before rising sharply into the hills, where the Germans had dug in. The bluffs were laced with concrete bunkers, pillboxes, trenches, and firing pits, all interconnected by a maze of tunnels. German gunners, some firing through narrow slits, rained down death with ruthless precision. The Americans knew that until those positions were silenced, the beach would remain a slaughterhouse. Then came the engineers, some of the bravest men on the beach. Under relentless fire, they crawled forward with explosives strapped to their chests, setting charges to blow gaps through barbed wire and mines. Their efforts opened the first paths forward. With a few Sherman tanks now firing from the beach and a handful of artillery units landing shells into the cliffs, the tide slowly began to turn. American troops began scaling the bluff slopes, using craters, ditches, and the dead zones between German arcs of fire. As the morning wore on, American naval gunfire support also found its rhythm. Destroyers like the USS Frankfurt and USS McCook moved dangerously close to shore, well inside their planned limits, to fire directly at enemy bunkers. Their guns blasted open fortified positions, creating windows of opportunity for advancing infantry. By 11 a.m., nearly 5 hours after the first landings, American troops had finally begun breaking through. It wasn't clean. It wasn't organized. But it was happening. Against all odds, small groups of exhausted, bloodied men were pushing up the bluffs, reaching the first German trenches, engaging the enemy in brutal, close-quarters combat. The battle was far from over, but the momentum, slowly, painfully, was beginning to shift. And for the men still trapped on the sand below, every inch gained meant another chance to live. By midday on June 6, 1944, after hours of chaos and slaughter, a critical transformation was unfolding at Omaha Beach. The tide was rising, and not just the water. Against all odds, American forces were breaking through. What had started as a catastrophic landing now teetered on the edge of a turning point. Small, scattered squads, men from different companies, even different divisions, had begun climbing the bluffs overlooking the beach. There were no organized battalions now, only fragments of units moving through narrow ravines, scaling muddy slopes, and crawling through hedgerows under fire. They weren't following orders. They were making their own. The German defenders, while still deadly, were beginning to feel the strain. Many had expected the beach landings to be repelled at the waterline, as their commanders had promised. But now, their bunkers were under assault from above and behind. Ammunition was running low. Communication lines were disrupted. Some defensive positions had been isolated and flanked. For the first time that day, the Wehrmacht felt the pressure of collapse. At the western sector of Omaha, known as Dog Green, one of the deadliest zones, Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment had been nearly wiped out in the first 15 minutes of landing. But survivors regrouped with Rangers from Point du Hoc, who had landed nearby, and began climbing the cliffs. These soldiers brought the fight directly to the bunkers and pillboxes, tossing grenades into firing ports and engaging in fierce hand-to-hand combat. In another sector, Lieutenant Charles D. Canham, despite a leg wound, rallied the 116th Infantry and led his men inland through gaps cleared by engineers. His determination helped push past one of the strongest points of German resistance. Every foot gained cost blood, but every foot gained opened new routes for those still pinned below. Meanwhile, American destroyers, acting outside of their original mission plans, performed heroic close support missions. Ships like the USS Doyle and USS Carmick came within 800 yards of the beach, dangerously close for vessels of their size, to fire directly into the German fortifications. Their precise naval gunfire neutralized several strongpoints that had been murdering soldiers for hours. Back on the beach, engineers and infantry worked together to open more exits, paths through minefields, barbed wire, and tank traps. With cover from tanks and destroyers, and with German defenders increasingly distracted by fighting on the bluffs, more waves of infantry finally began to get off the sand and push inland. By early afternoon, elements of the 1st and 29th Divisions were beginning to link up. What had started as dozens of small, isolated skirmishes were now forming into a broader front. These were not the coordinated battle lines envisioned by generals and war planners, but they were effective. American forces were now engaging German defenders across multiple points beyond the bluffs. German units, lacking reinforcements and confused by the scale of the attack, began pulling back to secondary positions deeper inland. Though some held firm, many saw the writing on the wall. The sheer mass of the American assault was finally beginning to overwhelm them. By 3 p.m., for the first time all day, commanders on the American side began to breathe more freely. Omaha Beach had not been secured, but it was no longer the death trap it had been that morning. Landing craft could now offload reinforcements with less immediate danger. Supply lines, still fragile, were beginning to form. The wounded were being evacuated. The dead, solemnly, were being moved to makeshift positions along the shore. The price of progress was staggering, but the impossible had begun to happen. The Americans had breached the Atlantic Wall, and the door to Nazi-occupied France had been kicked open. By late afternoon on June 6, 1944, the tide at Omaha Beach had shifted. What began as a massacre had slowly evolved into a grinding, hard-won advance. American forces were now pushing beyond the shingle and bluffs, into the fields and hedgerows of Normandy. The cost had been staggering. Thousands of American soldiers had fallen in the surf, on the sand, and at the base of the cliffs. Yet despite the horror, the survivors continued forward. Driven by duty, instinct, and each other, they were now beginning to link up inland, forming the first true beachhead at Omaha. Across the 6-mile stretch, various breakout points emerged. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the 29th Infantry Division were now pressing inland, clearing remaining pockets of German resistance. Using grenades, flamethrowers, and rifles, they stormed bunkers, neutralized machine gun nests, and dismantled firing positions that had inflicted such catastrophic losses earlier in the day. The terrain beyond the bluffs presented new challenges. Normandy's countryside was a patchwork of hedgerows, dense, ancient earth embankments overgrown with trees and shrubs. These natural barriers provided cover for retreating German units, and concealed threats at every turn. Movement was slow, cautious, and often deadly. Yet the Americans pressed on, clearing paths, establishing communication lines, and marking positions for artillery and logistics units to land. By early evening, beach engineers had widened several of the exits off the beach, allowing tanks and trucks to start moving inland. Naval vessels continued firing throughout the day, pounding enemy strongpoints ahead of the advancing troops. The coordination between infantry and ships, though improvised under fire, had become increasingly effective. Smoke markers and radio contact helped direct fire against enemy targets spotted in real time. Still, German resistance remained fierce in places. Isolated groups of defenders, cut off from their main lines but determined to hold ground, continued to resist. Some bunkers had to be cleared room by room. Others were bypassed entirely, only to be cleared by follow-on units later. In some cases, American soldiers used captured German weapons to continue the fight when their own ammunition ran low. Back on the beach, the wounded were gathered into makeshift aid stations. Medics, some of whom had worked non-stop for 10 hours or more, moved among the injured, treating burns, bullet wounds, and shrapnel injuries. The beach was littered with wrecked vehicles, flooded landing craft, and the fallen, many of whom would never be identified. Reinforcements continued arriving in waves, bringing fresh troops, supplies, and a new layer of organization. By the end of the day, over 34,000 American soldiers had landed at Omaha Beach. Against all expectations, and at a staggering human cost, they had carved out a fragile but growing foothold on Hitler's fortress Europe. That night, exhausted soldiers dug into the Norman soil. They fortified their positions, laid mines, and tried to rest under the stars, knowing that the coming days would bring more battles, more blood, and more loss. But they also knew something else. They had made it. They had survived Omaha. And in doing so, they had helped ensure the success of the entire D-Day invasion. The enemy still held France, but now there was a crack in the wall, a crack made not by generals or strategy alone, but by the grit and blood of ordinary men who had faced the impossible and refused to quit. As night fell on June 6, 1944, the beachhead at Omaha was secured, but far from safe. The soft light of the setting sun revealed the full horror of the day's fighting: twisted metal, smoldering wreckage, and the bodies of thousands of young men who had never made it past the surf. The tide washed gently over the sand, silently reclaiming what it could. Soldiers who had survived the landing now faced a new challenge, holding the ground they had paid for in blood. The chaos of the initial assault was slowly giving way to structure. Commanders began to re-establish order. Makeshift command posts were set up. Platoons were reformed from the battered remnants of companies. Maps were updated, and plans were redrawn. The mission was no longer just about surviving the beach, it was about pushing inland and beginning the liberation of France. But the night brought its own dangers. German counterattacks were expected. Though the defenders at Omaha had been heavily damaged, many had retreated in good order to secondary positions. Under cover of darkness, snipers and scattered infantry units probed the American lines. Occasional bursts of gunfire echoed through the hedgerows. Patrols went out cautiously, tense and exhausted, ears straining for movement in the night. For the soldiers on the ground, sleep was nearly impossible. Many had gone for over 24 hours without rest, food, or clean water. Still, they dug foxholes, reinforced positions, and prepared for a new day of combat. Some took quiet moments to ride home. Others sat in silence, staring out into the darkness, haunted by what they'd seen and unsure of what lay ahead. Medical personnel worked through the night, tending to the wounded in improvised aid stations. Supplies were low. Blood was everywhere. Surgeons operated by flashlight, saving who they could. Chaplains moved among the dying, offering prayers and final words. On the beach, the dead were gathered into rows, their gear and identification carefully collected for those waiting back home. Despite the cost, the success of the landings at Omaha carried immense strategic weight. It allowed the Allies to link Omaha with Utah Beach to the west, and eventually with British and Canadian forces to the east. By securing these footholds, the Allies had opened a path to move troops, vehicles, and supplies into continental Europe, a path that would become a flood in the weeks ahead. Back in England, news of the landings had begun to spread. Families gathered around radios, straining to hear updates. The initial reports were vague, cautious, even, but hopeful. The invasion had begun. Victory, while still far away, now felt within reach. For the men who had landed on Omaha, the sense of accomplishment was mixed with grief. They had survived, but so many hadn't. Every hill climbed, every bunker cleared, had been bought at a terrible price. And yet, they understood something vital. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. The foothold they had seized on that beach was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. As the stars glimmered above and the fires of battle cooled, one truth became clear to everyone who had been there. June 6th would be remembered forever. Omaha had tested the limits of courage and resolve. It had broken some, and forged others into legends. And though the fighting would rage on for months, even years, the tide of history had turned. Not with glory, but with grit. By the morning of June 7, 1944, the fog of war still lingered over Omaha, both literally and emotionally. The beach, once a killing ground, was now a staging area. Supply trucks and reinforcements began to roll ashore, moving cautiously through the wreckage. The air still carried the smell of smoke, sea salt, and something deeper, the unmistakable scent of war. The soldiers who had survived the landing wasted no time. There was little rest, and no relief. Now came the next phase of the campaign, pushing inland through Normandy's bocage, a network of hedgerows, narrow roads, and stone-walled farms that would prove nearly as deadly as the beach itself. Though the beachhead had been established, the area around Omaha was far from secure. German forces, regrouping in pockets, began launching small-scale counterattacks to harass the Americans and delay their advance. Snipers took shots from farmhouses. Mortars landed without warning in fields. Machine gun nests, overlooked in the first day of fighting, were discovered with deadly consequences. But the Americans pushed forward, clearing hamlets and fields one by one. Reinforcements from 7 Corps and 19 Corps began to arrive in strength. Tanks rolled cautiously along narrow lanes, their turrets swiveling side to side. Engineers cleared mines and built temporary bridges over bombed-out culverts. Artillery was brought inland and began shelling known German positions deeper in the countryside. Still, the terrain worked in the defenders' favor. The thick hedgerows, sometimes 6 feet high and centuries old, made it nearly impossible to see ahead. German troops used them expertly, ambushing American patrols, then disappearing into the maze of fields. Every advance became a battle of inches. Meanwhile, Omaha Beach itself was being transformed. What had been a battlefield just hours before was becoming a bustling logistical hub. Bulldozers flattened craters and cleared debris. Rows of supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, medical kits, lined the sand. Makeshift hospitals were set up, where wounded soldiers were stabilized before evacuation back to England. Fallen soldiers were carefully buried in temporary cemeteries, their graves marked by simple wooden crosses. The beach was now a vital artery for the Allied advance. Over the next several days, thousands more men and tons of supplies would come ashore. What had once seemed nearly lost was becoming a bridgehead to liberation. Among the troops, the shock of Omaha lingered. Veterans of the beach often fell silent when asked about it. Many never spoke of it again. Those who did remembered the chaos, the noise, the blood, and the bravery, especially the bravery. They remembered seeing medics run into gunfire to save strangers. They remembered friends who had died before even reaching the shore. They remembered the terror, and the courage it took to keep moving anyway. Commanders took stock of the situation. General Omar Bradley, who had overseen the American landings, recognized both the failures and the triumphs of the previous day. Lessons were learned quickly. Communications were improved. Units were better organized. And above all, commanders understood that success at Omaha had come not from planning alone, but from the tenacity and determination of the men on the ground. The price had been enormous. But the mission was far from over. France was not yet free. The war was not yet won. But the gate had been opened. And now, with every mile gained beyond Omaha, the men who had fought and bled on that beach carried with them something unbreakable: momentum. As the days passed beyond June 6th, the world began to understand what had happened on Omaha Beach, not in the language of maps and objectives, but in the faces of the wounded, the voices of survivors, and the silence left behind by the fallen. The official numbers told part of the story. By the end of D-Day, over 2,400 American soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing on Omaha alone, making it the bloodiest of all 5 landing beaches. But the true toll was far greater. Behind every statistic was a life cut short, a family shattered, a name etched into memory. In field hospitals just off the beach, surgeons worked around the clock. There was no time to grieve. Medics, many of them barely older than the men they treated, moved from cot to cot with bloodied hands and hollow eyes. Some patients had limbs missing. Others were unrecognizable. The sounds of pain and quiet prayers filled the air. Back in England, casualty lists began to take shape. Western Union messengers arrived at doorsteps in small towns and big cities across the United States. Mothers clutched telegrams with trembling hands. Wives collapsed on porches. Fathers stood motionless in doorways, reading the words no parent ever wants to see. And yet, through the grief, something else began to emerge, a deep, shared understanding that Omaha had been necessary. That the sacrifice had meaning. That the brutal hours on that narrow strip of sand had changed the course of the war, and, in time, the course of history. Survivors struggled with that meaning, too. Many questioned why they had lived when their friends had not. Some returned to the beach days later, walking among the wreckage, searching for closure. Others stayed silent for years, speaking only in letters, journals, or tears when no one was watching. In the ranks, medals were awarded, many posthumously. Stories of extraordinary bravery began to circulate. A soldier who destroyed a German pillbox with a satchel charge, saving an entire platoon. A medic who carried wounded men across the sand under fire for hours. A commander who led with calm determination until he was cut down mid-sentence. The names of these men became part of Omaha's legacy. At the same time, German defenders faced their own reckoning. Though many fought fiercely, others were young conscripts, teenagers from occupied countries, forced into uniforms not their own. Some had fought for survival, others for ideology. Many were killed where they stood, while others were captured and taken prisoner. War, as always, blurred the lines between hero and victim. As the beach transformed from battlefield to supply hub, bulldozers and engineers cleared wreckage, but the scars remained. Rusted landing craft, burnt-out tanks, and silent rifles lay scattered like relics of a forgotten world. Graves were dug with reverence. Chaplains spoke softly. Flags were folded. Dog tags were collected. Across the Atlantic, the American people began to hear the stories. Newspapers ran headlines of the landings and victory, but also of the cost. Photographs, black and white and grainy, showed rows of crosses on the sand. President Roosevelt addressed the nation with words of mourning and pride. "They fight not for the lust of conquest," he said, "but to end conquest." Omaha Beach became a symbol, not just of sacrifice, but of what happens when ordinary people rise to meet extraordinary challenges. When freedom is threatened and answered not with fear, but with courage. The men who fought there had changed the world, even if they didn't live to see it. In the weeks following D-Day, the Allied forces expanded their grip on Normandy. What had begun as a tenuous beachhead carved out through sheer determination on June 6 turned into a growing front, pushing deeper into occupied France. But the memory of Omaha Beach remained fresh in the minds of every soldier who passed through its sand. By mid-June 1944, hundreds of thousands of troops had landed. The beach, once soaked in blood, had become a highway of men, machines, and supplies. Bulldozers had smoothed the sand. Landing craft came and went around the clock. Engineers constructed roads and temporary ports. The dead were buried in long rows just inland, their names carefully recorded, their graves marked with white wooden crosses. But the fighting was far from over. The countryside beyond Omaha, Normandy's bocage, offered its own deadly challenges. The Germans had fallen back into well-defended positions in the dense hedgerows, turning every lane and field into an ambush. The terrain made tanks almost useless and visibility nearly impossible. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. For the American troops who had come ashore at Omaha, the shift from beach to bocage was disorienting. Gone was the wide-open expanse of sand. Now they moved through a green maze, constantly wary of mines, snipers, and sudden attacks. German artillery and mortars rained down with deadly precision. Each new village liberated came at a price. But the Americans had learned. The survivors of Omaha were no longer rookies. Hardened by fire, they used what they had learned on the beach, adaptability, communication, leadership under chaos, and applied it inland. Small unit tactics improved. Air support grew more coordinated. Artillery and armor learned to work around the hedgerows. They weren't just holding the line anymore. They were pushing it. As weeks turned into months, the Allied forces broke through Normandy, liberated Saint-Lô, and moved toward Paris. By late summer, the Germans were retreating. Operation Overlord had become a success, not in a single day, but over many. And at its center stood Omaha Beach, the hardest won ground of them all. Back in the United States, stories from the front began to paint a clearer picture of what had happened on June 6th. War correspondents and returning soldiers gave interviews. Black and white photographs captured both the horror and the heroism. Names like Pointe du Hoc, Dog Green Sector, and Vierville Draw became etched into the American consciousness. The war still raged on. The battle for France would continue. The drive into Germany had not yet begun. But something had shifted. The Allies had proven they could not only land in Europe, they could fight and win there. And for every success that followed, Omaha was always present. In the trenches, soldiers remembered the faces of those they'd lost on the beach. They fought for them. They honored them with each step forward. Every bullet fired, every German position taken, every liberated town, it all traced back to the moment when the first boots hit the water under fire. In a way, Omaha Beach never really ended. It continued with every soldier who survived it. With every letter home. With every memory carried into the next battle. It had started as the most dangerous place on Earth. Now, it was a foundation. A launching point. A symbol of everything that came next. Years passed. The war ended. Europe was liberated. The world tried to heal. But Omaha Beach remained. A place where history didn't fade, but deepened with time. In the decades after June 6, 1944, veterans of the Normandy landings returned to the windswept coast of northern France. Some came alone. Some came with families, children, and grandchildren who had only known peace. They stood in silence at the water's edge, looking out at the calm sea that had once run red. There were fewer of them with each passing year, but those who returned never forgot. The sound of the surf still reminded them of distant gunfire. The feel of the sand beneath their feet carried echoes of brothers lost. For them, Omaha was not just a place, it was a memory etched into the soul. France never forgot either. The people of Normandy tended the graves, preserved the bunkers, and honored the men who came from across the ocean to free them. Streets were named after American units. Children learned the history in school. Local families told stories passed down through generations, of the day the sea brought liberation, and the price that was paid for it. On the cliffs above Omaha, a cemetery was built. Row upon row of white marble crosses and stars of David face west, toward America. Each one bears a name, a rank, and a date, June 6, 1944. The cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer became a place of pilgrimage. Not just for Americans, but for people from all over the world who came to walk the paths between the graves, read the names, and feel the weight of what happened there. Presidents laid wreaths. Generals saluted. But it was the quiet visits, the hand on a headstone, the folded note, the terrant silence, that truly defined the legacy of Omaha. Historians would come to call it a military miracle, a triumph of courage and determination. They wrote of strategy, of German defenses, of terrain and timing. But no textbook could fully capture the experience of a private in the surf, dodging bullets, dragging a wounded comrade, or whispering goodbye to a friend. The Battle of Omaha Beach was never about perfection. It was about perseverance. It was about young men thrust into the darkest hour, facing an enemy fortified and prepared, and pushing forward anyway. It was about sacrifice, not because they wanted to die, but because they were willing to, so others might live free. And that sacrifice built the future. It allowed Europe to rebuild. It paved the way for democracy to return. It helped end a war that had swallowed continents and claimed millions. Today, the beach looks peaceful. Tourists walk where tanks once burned. Children play in the waves where soldiers once fell. But beneath that calm lies a sacred memory. Omaha Beach is not a monument of stone. It is a memory of courage, of loss, of freedom born through fire. And it reminds us, always, that the price of liberty is high, but that there were once men who paid it, together, on a strip of sand in France. June 6, 1944. Omaha. Never forgotten.